There's already, so much, so many that believe the Holocaust never happened, and Holocaust denial, and even just in ignorance of it. I saw an interesting YouTube interview. This person went onto a college campus, I believe in Pennsylvania, and began asking just some real basic questions about the Holocaust. And these university students, they couldn't even answer the simplest things. So it's not being taught in some places in the school system. And again, as a remembrance, one of the things that we say regarding the Holocaust is never forget. It's a slogan that we have. And so it's important for us never to forget. So it's important for us to remember it each year and even all throughout the year, throughout our lives. And so we say never forget so that it should never happen again. And if we forget what has happened in the past, history will repeat itself. And if we forget how God has led it in our past, we will lose hope.
And people were coming to our apartment, so my father could translate from the German to Polish what Hitler was saying. And he was saying the most unbelievable things, but how could it be possible to understand and pay any attention to it as a warning? My mother was orphaned when she was a baby, and she was adopted by a very well-to-do family. So she traveled with them as a child and as a teenager all over the world. And one of the famous, the most excited places that she could think of, and they would travel all over the world, they were rich people, Germany. She remembered the Alps, the German Alps, the music, the culture. So there was always a tug of war between my mother and my father when he was listening and he was telling these things that Hitler was saying. And she said, after the neighbors left, she says, "Why are you doing this to these people? Hitler he's just a bombastic liar. He's talking about things that will never happen. I know Germany." And they were so arguing back and forth about it. Well, it just so happened that all that he was saying, he had a plan for it. It was nothing that he invented right then and there. He had it in his heart and in his mind. As a matter of fact, if anybody cared to read his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, it was all there. All the T's were crossed, all the I's were dotted. And maybe he didn't say it in all the virulent way that he finally did it, but it was bad enough. What he did, of course, is just like all the demagogues in the world do it. They said things that are attractive to some people, and they'll fall for it. There's always an element of that is an additional incentive to give something to his people who are listening to him. So he, for example, he knew that as far as the Jews were concerned, as far as Hitler was concerned, they were an inferior race. They were just like cockroaches. They were not capable of any thinking, of contributing to the glory of the Third Reich, the German regime. But the art and the belongings and the treasures that were Jewish, they were okay. Otherwise, we will take it from the Jews and we'll give it to you. and this was the additional incentive. Historians say that some of the German people, of course, they knew that he was lying. He knew that he was a demagogue, but they figured, well, listen, let's see what he can do. So this was the problem. As about this, he was saying that he didn't come out right and say that we'll plunder the Jews, but he says the Jews have acquired so many worth. They shouldn't. They acquired it by fraud, by thievery, and all that. But we are going to get it from them. As a matter of fact, it is a very the Emperor Hadrian in ancient Rome, he decided that to tax public restrooms. So one of the senators at that time were very much, appalled of this. How can you do a thing like this? This will be, the money will smell. So the Emperor Hadrian responded, "Pecunia not olet." Money doesn't smell. The same with Hitler. He says, the money the Germans, that the Jews have, it's all right, it won't smell, we'll take it. So this incentive and this constant propaganda, these rallies that you of course seen, on television that attracted hundreds of thousands of people, and the bombast and that visceral feeling that he projected. Hitler was a very charismatic person. People were really spellbound, but he was saying. They even didn't believe him. He says, well, I think we'll just go with it. So in 1943, when the war was already well under the way, by that, of course, half of the Europe, most of the Europe was conquered by Germany, half of the Soviet Union, not half, but quite a big chunk, all the way to Stalingrad and Moscow. North Africa fell to the Germans. He decided that it's about time to take care of the Jews, because after all, I have to deliver on something that I promised. So there was a conference in a suburb of Berlin, and there was to be a final solution. The final solution, of course, was something that the German industry was very much involved in. Because killing Jews just by piecemeal was not right. As a matter of fact, the German psychologist said that to kill, for a German soldier, to kill a person just face to face, it's not right, because they won't be able to sleep, they will be affected psychologically. So we're going to do it somewhere differently. We're going to maybe try something more efficient. Maybe gas will be better. So the German industry, with cooperation with other industries all over the world, one of them, unfortunately, was DuPont company, and they decided that gas would be more efficient. So they decided, well, let's try gas. So we'll try it. Instead of killing 1 or 2 people with rifles, we will put 50 people or maybe 60 people in a bus, and we'll put gas over there. That worked. Of course, the gas was not as efficient, and they were working on the gas being more and more efficient, but it was much better than killing just people individually. But again, he promised to annihilate every Jew on the face of this earth. To do it piecemeal like this, by bus loads, was no good. So the German industry, that famous industry that was envied by the rest of the world, chemical industry and medicine, were put to work to devise something better. So the next thing, of course, were gas chambers. Now, gas chambers were more efficient. After all, they could fool 300 or 400 people into a chamber, tell them that they are going to be deloused, that they are full with lice, and they are dirty. They are going to be put in a chamber where they will be finally able to wash themselves. But instead of with the water that was supposed to come from the openings in the wall, from the vents in the wall, in the ceiling, gas was coming out. So this is how the German industry, the industry that was one of the pillars of any industry in the world. As a matter of fact, the whole country, Germany was a pillar of the Western civilization at that time. But this same country, through that hatred, through the demagoguery, and through a person who was really determined, who had his heart and mind set on doing something, that's what he got his people to be willing accomplices. But of course, there were always problems, because you gas people 300, 400 at a time. By the time the day is over, crematoria, for example, in Auschwitz or in Majdanek, gas chambers are producing so many people, so many corpses, that how are we going to get rid of them? So, again, the glorious German industry came with something. There is an exhibit, I don't know how many of you were in a Jewish Holocaust Museum. On the first floor, there is an exhibit that's a facsimile of a letter that the manufacturer of the crematoria sent to the German government, asking for an increase in a payment, because the crematorium that they developed now is going to be able to do between 1,000 and 1,500 corpses a day. So such an amazing feat that we accomplished pays, is worth more money. So then, of course, we came to the gassing and burning people alive. But this was the end. To some people, it was actually the blessing. Because now I'll tell you something about what was before the final breath that people could take before they were gassed. After the war, I was in Lublin. It's a place in Poland where there was a site of a very terrible concentration camp, not as notorious as Auschwitz, but just as bad. And it just so happened I was 17 years old, and I was working with an outfit that was guarding German prisoners. And at one point, there were 4 or 5 prisoners coming in, and we just got used to them. We were guarding them. We never laid our hands on them. We knew that they were German prisoners because some of them, they were still, we could see they were German, parts of the German uniforms. And they're working hard because the Russians were dismantling all the industry in Poland, shipping it back to Russia. So the German prisoners were working as laborers, and they worked so hard. They were sweating. There were these big machinery. It happened to be a printing machinery, very big machinery, and of course there was everything had to be lifted by hand. And one day, another group came by, and we were just wondering what happened to the other people. Well, we found out that they were the guards, the Majdanek. I promised myself that I won't get emotional about these things, but I'll get over it. So I said to my supervisor, I'm leaving. I just gave him my rifle. I say, I'm going to go to attend the trial. Well, the trial was unbelievable. I thought that I knew most of what happened in the Holocaust, but it was nothing that came even close what I suffered to what the other people, some of the survivors who were brought on stretchers to be able to stay witness to the crimes that were perpetrated by these 4 guys. And eventually they were, of course, sentenced to die. They were executed by hanging on a site of the concentration camps, and there was a public execution. And I remember when they were sentenced by the Polish judge, they call it procurator, and he said, and I never forget this and I live, he said that nowhere in the history of jurisprudence has it done or has been allowed for a judge to add a wish to a sentence, a personal wish. And he was, incidentally, the same judge was later a Polish representative to the Nuremberg trials. And he says, I would like to make my wish, and he was talking to these prisoners, I wish that as the noose is tightening around your necks, when your eyesight is becoming opaque, at the opacity of your eyes, you should see a woman with a child being pushed in a gas chamber. And I think, to me, this is always the quintessence of what Holocaust was. If we can imagine how a woman, or for that matter a man, could be pushed forced in the gas chambers with a child. So there was suffering, of course. Thank you. So there was suffering, of course, before the final breath was taken by the victims. Like I've mentioned to before, everything was planned. How the German mind, that was so inventive, could do things like that, so brutal and so barbaric, so bestial. As a matter of fact, I use these three words: bestial, barbaric, and brutal, because one day I was asked in a question that I had after I had my presentation. They said, "How can you be so accusing people like that? A country or people of Bach's, Brahms, and Beethoven." And so I thought about it, and I went home, and I thought, next time when somebody asks me like this, I say the three B's that come to my mind when I think of the Germans is bestiality, brutality, and barbarity. That's what it was. So how can they invent those things? First of all, from the very beginning, how did they get to us? How did they make us completely deprived of any feelings as human beings? That started very benignly, nothing terrible. It was crowding. People, Jews, for example, we lived in town, it was 40,000 people, 4,000 were Jews. A very nice, beautiful, cultural town. The town, 1,000-year-old. As a matter of fact, one of the Polish kings is buried in the cathedral in Płock. And so all of a sudden, the 4,000 Jews that lived in this town of 40,000 people were told there are certain areas that you have to move. Because after all, and here's something that's very important to understand, you know, we are really care about you, but you know, you live among Polish people, and Polish people finally are realizing that you're their enemies. People, we went to, I went to a Catholic school as a Jew in our town. There was nothing problem, but they were putting sowing the hatred into the Polish people. And of course, there were quite a lot of anti-Semites in Poland, just like in any other country, maybe more so. But that's what it is. So please, there will be 4 or 5 streets that you will be able to live. So you have to move. So let's see, by next week, you know, we want you to be all here. I'm sure that you have friends and relatives in these areas that we are designated for you, and they'll be very happy to accommodate you. Well, of course, that was inconvenience, but what could we do? Sometimes we accepted relatives, sometimes neighbors, sometimes people that we knew and cared about it. It was an inconvenience, but we figured we can live with that. Germans used, only in addition to brutal strength, that of course we have no way of, defending ourselves. It was always the deceit, always the lies. They were looking you straight in the face and lying to you. It was always, we were never moved anywhere without being told that it's better for you. Well, first of all, the Polish people, your compatriots, don't care too much about you. Then, of course, you happen to be many Jews, you're communists, and we are fighting the Soviet Union. So we want to shield you from any harm that will be done to you as communists. So we'll put you somewhere in another city. So at one point, we are told that we have to leave our city, where we lived, where we were born, and we had a very nice, normal life. And we're told that at one point, certain day, we have to leave our houses, our apartments, and stay in front of the buildings, take with us everything that we can, because the rest that you leave, your furniture, your valuables, your furs, whatever you cannot take with you in your suitcases will be sent to you. But whatever you can, take it with you. So we were standing for hours in a freezing, rainy, January, cold day in Poland. In Poland, in January, it can be very, very cold. And finally, after hours and hours, we are numb from the cold. The parents, of course, the adults are numb with fear, but we're numb just because with kids. So finally, the trucks, the flatbed trucks come in, and we say, please, the transportation is ready, board the trucks. Leave these things with you. The suitcase and all that, it'll be sent to you. So we go in on the trucks, and it's raining, and it's cold, it's freezing, sleet and snow, freezing rain. And on those flatbed trucks, they take us to the northern Polish, to a border, north of Poland. We are put for 2 days in a big, big campus, whether it was after the war we found out it was to be army barracks. It looked like a school, big, enormous place, and the classrooms. The classrooms were open, but there was no benches, no chairs. There was straw on the floor, and it was the first time we saw straw as our bedding on the floor. What was unusual about it, that the classes were open, but the restrooms were locked. So in that terrible winter, and this was north of Poland, northern Poland, it was really cold. There was a ring that might have been a skating ring or hockey ring, whatever ring. So anybody who had to relieve themselves, go for they had to be done outside, right there on this rink, frozen ice. All the biological function had to be done down there in open, men, women, and children. Those, of course, who objected to it, foolishly, were beaten, some of them were killed. This was the first time that we realized things are not going to be so good wherever we're going. But with all that, and I repeat the saying, we didn't realize that what we just suffered in this little place, incidentally, there was a movie later, German-made movie after the war, about assassination of Hitler. I don't know. That city, Soldau, was in a movie, you know. But to us, there was no picnic. And we thought, how worse can things get? So after these 2 days in that place in Soldau, we are put on trains, not cattle trains, regular trains, and we're going back south to southern Poland. Did you notice that was the confusion? They could have sent us all the way down because they knew where our final destination is going to be. This in place Bodzentin in south of Poland. But let's take them first up north. Let them suffer a little bit. Let them get confused. Let them start feeling like they're animals, not human beings. So I think we can get our plan finalized. Of course, this was so ridiculous because we had no weapons. We could not, defend ourselves. But it was sheer hatred, seeing us completely immobilized. Why we were so immobilized? Not because we were just confused. We didn't know whether we were coming or going because of the different lies. But in this little town they took us, it was a little shtetl, a little Jewish, it was a Polish town, but maybe 100 Jewish families. There was a gentleman here that talked to me before, his name is Weintraub, and one of the there were two leading families in this town, in that town, Bodzentin. One was Weintraub, one was Schechter, and these were people who mostly were making living as tailors, shoemakers, barbers, dressmakers, and they had shops, and they plying their trade. But because 800 of us from our town, incidentally 4,000 Jews that were in this other town, we were divided in groups. Our groups was 800, about 708 people. So we were dumped on this little town that had 100 Jewish families that were poor, that had very little education in many cases. And where we were going to live? In those stork fronts that they had to abandon to allow us to live in there. So then my mother and two sisters were in this house, in this one of the storefronts, on Angiewicza Street. Of course, after the war, I got the pictures of it. You can get it on Google. You can get the whole story of what happened. But we didn't know that. We were isolated. We were helpless. We were hopeless. The situation was hopeless. And 3 families of us lived in that place. And I told you that we didn't think, when we were in that German barracks, housed in the German barracks, when we had to relieve ourselves in public, we couldn't think that things could get worse. But they got worse. Lack of sanitation was something that the Germans practiced on us with an unbelievable brutality. They knew that by crowding us, the ghettos was, they were just not to help us, but to crowd us, so we'll have no hygiene, that we'll have no access to medication, we'll have no access to medical help, we'll have no access to any culture. And then, of course, with the lack of hygiene, what do you have? In this little storefront where we lived, there was one spigot of water, but the water was coming dirty, black, it was just like the water, much worse than the one that you just hear in Flint. That was that problem with water. So we were covered with lice. All our days and nights, we were busy with killing lice. And how do we kill lice? There was no, now of course, that still there are lice, head lice, every once in a while, and there are medications, there are shampoos and things like that can do. But these were different lice. There were lice, in our clothing. We just covered with it. All we could do is squeeze it with our hands, one at a time, and there were hundreds of thousands on us. Well, it was disgusting, but that was the worst of it. These lice were causing typhus epidemic. And typhus, of course, nowadays, you don't hear about typhus, but whenever in some countries still there, it's a deadly disease, even though with medical help. But people in this town of Bodzentin where we were, people were dying from typhus. It was just a terrible sight. My own sister was stricken by typhus. The Germans, of course, when they realized that it was an epidemic, after all, there was a small German garrison over there, not really German garrison, but the Germans were coming to the little town from a different garrison, and of course they didn't want to have the typhus spread to the rest of the population, so they took people who were stricken by typhus, they put them on a push carts. There's always the push carts, but there was always straw, and they were taking them somewhere. My sister survived, but when she came in, she was like a skeleton. We were in this little storefront. We had, the three families had 3 bunk beds, with just wooden slats put together with straw again. And she could not sit on it, she could not, because she had no flesh. So she was hurting. Plus, so we were spending our days and nights, all our waking hours, killing lice and starving. Because starvation is something that is very difficult for anybody who hasn't been affected by starvation, but we were. We were given from the German government, we were given rations every day. It was a piece of bread and some warm water. If they had a 50-gallon pot or that were maybe they boiled 2 potatoes in it, 50 gallons of water, 2 potatoes, nothing, no calories, no nutrition. So we were starving. And this was something that there was a choice. Was the lice was the problem, or lack of bread? In that little town were 2 bakeries. And when the fresh bread was baked every day, when there was unfortunately sometimes, the wind was blowing our way and the smell of bread it was actually physical pain. that smell of bread was causing physical pain. Just if somebody would put a knife in you, part of your body, and twisted it, and twisted it. Some people, I was trying sometimes to explain how it felt. And the only way that I can explain is, drug addicts who are lost really on heroin or other, opiates, how need a fix. And nothing is important to them. Not their own life, not their family's life, not the children, not the grandchildren. They just want the fix. And that's what we wanted. And it was not coming. And as we were weakened physically and psychologically, not that we could have helped ourselves really, but of course we were deprived. There was no television naturally. There was no, we couldn't have newspapers, couldn't have radio, but for some reason, by gossip, we used to learn that all these trains that are supposed to take us to a safer place, they're not taking us there. They're taking us to places where they kill us. So that realization was really sinking in, seeping in very, very slowly. And in larger cities, people decided where there was some viable hierarchy. There were people who were, before the war, they were involved in politics, in protests against Polish government or Czech government or any other government. That's how these people decided, well, we're not going to go to slaughter like sheep. We're going to try to resist. In Warsaw, my father, I mentioned to you, I don't know if you realize, when I said when we were in this little town that we were sent to, it was my mother and two sisters. My father, at the very beginning of the war, had to flee our town because he was accused of some sabotage, and he was just about to be arrested. So he went to Warsaw. So we were in this small little town, suffering the typhus and hunger, and so my one older sister and I decided we'll try to smuggle ourselves out of this little town and maybe go to another town that has a railroad siding, a railroad train, and we can go to Warsaw. And we left Poland, and we left this town. There was about 40 miles between where we lived, where we were housed in these little storefronts, and the next town that had a railroad. So one night, my sister and I, we knew that that town was there. We had no magnet, we had nothing. We just walked foot after foot. And we finally, after maybe a long trek, we got to this other city. We knew there were other group of our Jews from our town in that city. So we had people who gave us some money. We boarded a train without any identification, without anything. if we could be as much as asked who you are by a conductor, we'd have been dead. But for some reason, I guess that's why I get more and more thinking about it. And I'm getting more spiritual when I think about it. Why we survived. So we got to Warsaw. My sister was in the Warsaw ghetto for a few weeks, and the Polish underground gave her a false identification as a Roman Catholic, and she got a job outside of the ghetto. I was in the ghetto because I could pass as a Gentile. I became a courier for the underground. I was in and out of the ghetto, getting out by way of joining a work group that was performing hard labor outside of the ghetto for the German. Once I was with a group out of the ghetto, I would mix myself, I would get rid of my armband, and if I could, I got to a point where I was very good at it, and I would mix with the Polish people who were gathering around us. It was like a walking flea market. We were smuggling things out of the ghetto, usually things that were left by people who were sent to the gas chambers. And we would trade these things for foodstuff that on the way, after the work, after day's work, we could smuggle the foodstuff back into the ghetto, because that's how ghetto was being really supported. So that's what was happening, and to get in and out of the ghetto was not a very easy way of doing it, because it is very difficult for me to tell you that the anti-Semitism in Poland was very bad. We got to a point where we could not trust our compatriots, our neighbors. And this was very painful for us to feel like that, but it was also a dangerous thing. But there was a time that all this thing that I was thinking, how cruel people can be, and how terrible we were abandoned by our compatriots, came to a point where I had, in Catholic religion, it's epiphany, I think. Things happened, and I'll explain it to you. In 1943, the Germans decided that ghetto was completely liquidated. So we were again told, I was by then already in Warsaw ghetto, we were told that at a certain point the streets were all with German army, different, battalions. Some was SS, some was regular army. And we were told with bullhorns, get out, because you'll be sent somewhere. But at that time, we already knew that we'll not go anywhere. We knew by then that the destination are gas chambers. So in January 1943, we decided that we're not going to look, we're not going to listen to the bullhorns and telling us to get out. And we didn't come out. So there were skirmishes, there was some guns being shot, used on both sides, but the Germans retreated. We thought, what a tremendous victory for us. For the first time, the Germans told us to come out, and we decided we didn't listen to them. And the Germans were really impressed. We were euphoric about it. We were said, my goodness, what a tremendous victory. Why didn't you think about it before? Well, the euphoria was very short-lived, because in a true fashion, the Germans, they congratulated us. They told the Jewish government in the ghetto, they told, we are so impressed by it, and that we have 100 orphans, Jewish orphanages, about 100 kids, that we're going to send them to safety, we're going to release them. And they did. Well, we thought, unbelievable. But this was only short-lived, because 3 months later, on the eve of Passover, Germany, ghetto was surrounded by artillery, by tanks, automatic weapons, flamethrowers, and the ghetto was assaulted. The same army that conquered almost whole world was thrown against ghetto. Again, this is before I go a little bit further about that. In February of that year, my father, who was working in the other part of the ghetto for a German firm that was making uniforms for the German army, to get a job in that factory, Tebbens Incorporated, was a tremendous opportunity, because after all, it's just like a Schindler's List. It was a same factory that was working, doing things for German, but this was in Warsaw Ghetto, and because the war is on, they need the uniforms for the German army, so those who work for Tebbens, the name of the company was Tebbens, they are safe. So my father told me that, you know what, Tebbens decided that the production in Warsaw Ghetto is not very efficient, and we're going to be moved to another place, Poniatowa, near Warsaw, and there are much better factory, and we're going to get better compensation, the food will be a little bit better, and they were very much excited about it, because the deceit, the promises that the Germans were flooding us with was difficult to resist. But when they went to Poniatowa, there was a tremendous grave, mass grave, dug out, and they were all machine gunned. This shows you about the hatred and that almost incongruity about that whole Holocaust from how the Germans perpetrated it. They needed the uniforms for the German army. No, but killing Jews was more important. At the very end of the war, when the writing was all on the wall that the Germans were losing the war, they're being pushed back from Stalingrad by the Russians, and things were getting very bad for them. So the general staff of the German army petitioned Hitler. They needed more railroads. They needed railroads so they have more munition, go to the front, to the Russian front, so that they can defend themselves. Hitler refused it, because at this point, the German trains were busy taking Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. So you could see the psyche was how hateful could they be to hurt their own nose. I mean, it was just unbelievable. That's what it was. And the war, of course, the attack of the ghetto was very, very powerful. For all intents and purposes, our fight was over in a few days. We had no weapons, we had no ammunition, and the Germans were destroying buildings one by one. I was hiding with two other friends in a cellar because the resistance was already gone. Ghetto was burned to the ground. It was just burning embers. And we were, for many, many days or weeks, living there on rotten potatoes. That for a long time I thought that these rotten potatoes were, because before the war, of course, we had no refrigeration, so things were being stored in cellars because it was colder. So we thought that, well, some of the Jewish owner of that store stored his apples and potatoes in the cellar. Everything was fermented. The apples were impossible to even drink, but it was all alcohol-like. But we used the fermented, liquefied potatoes to eat a little bit, to drink, to wash ourselves up a little bit. And for this I was sick with dysentery and with scabies. It was so, my hands were so itching that was all bloody from itching. But one day I was disoriented because we tried to go at night maybe to see if we can find a way to get out of the ghetto, over the wall or maybe through the wall. But I was disoriented. I got during the day, and the Germans were patrolling the ruins of the ghetto for guys like us, survivors. They call them cellar rats. And they've already picked some people like me, and we were being led to the Umschlagplatz, to the very infamous railroad siding from which the trains were going to the gas chambers. And for some reason the fight was well over for weeks, and some shot rang out, and our escorts, incidentally, the escorts were not German, they were their satellites. They were either Lithuanians or Latvians. They were in uniforms, but they were not as efficient as the Germans. They looked differently, they smelled different. We knew that they were not Germans, and they were not as efficient. So when the fight started, when the shot rang out from somewhere, where still the ghetto was completely demolished, but the Germans still had some tanks, some artillery in it. So they were, all of a sudden, there was shooting at this building that was still there, and everybody ran, everybody fell to the ground, our escorts also. I ran somewhere, hid in the rubble of a demolished building. I waited there until night. Rats were nibbling at me, so I got up. I found an opening in the wall. All the time with me, I knew that if I had a chance to get out of the Warsaw Ghetto, I knew that my sister, was living as a Gentile. So I had a chance. So with all this place that I had, and all this thing that I slept for weeks or days, I had this shirt that I saved like the most wonderful thing that I owned. I had a clean shirt that I covered up with string, and there was an opening in a few bricks, opening in the wall. I put my hand through it with my shirt. How I squeezed myself, I don't know to this moment, but I did get out. Outside of the ghetto, there was a railroad station. On that railroad station, there was already morning, and there was a German hospital train bringing German soldiers, wounded soldiers from the Russian front. And of course, the train was besieged by people, asking for drinks, for cigarettes, for that. I went over and I asked in German, etwas essen, something to eat. And a young fellow, he could have been more than my age, in the blue pajamas, he was eating something and he gave it to me. For the first time, in I don't know how many weeks, I had a meal, macaroni and cheese, from the German army. I washed myself up and I decided I was going to see my sister. When I was a courier, I used to go and see my sister, so I knew where she was. When I came to her place where she was working, up to she died 2 years ago in Israel. She still could not understand, she could not believe how she survived, because she thought that I was dead. Because all throughout the ghetto was burning, this was a spectacle where people used to watch it. Just like today you see television show for entertainment. Some people use this as an entertainment. They would go on balconies and on rooftops, flat rooftops, and they used to watch that burning ghetto. And she was seeing it too. Some of the people were joking at it. Most of the people, of course. So it's a tragedy, but some people were joking. Some anti-Semites say, oh, the Jews are burning. There'll be cheap soap from us because they will make soap from the Jews. So that's how I got out of the ghetto. And now I told you something. I will end this with a maybe positive note. It is very difficult for me to talk about it because I get emotional, but I'll try not to. When I got out of the ghetto, incidentally, again, I must tell you, the deceit and the lies that were, after the ghetto was burned, completely destroyed, the Germans circulated a story, a fable, to Jews who were hiding outside of the ghetto, for whether they were hidden by friends or by good friends, or maybe they were hidden by people who were paid for it, Let's forget about it. There's bygone being bygones. We knew that you have suffered quite a bit, but we need you now, because some of our soldiers are interned in South America, and we need people like you to replace you for our interned prisoners of war. So if you come into this, what's called Polish hotel on a certain street, and we'll give the South American citizenship. You will be national of Bolivia or Argentina or Venezuela, and you'll be free. We need you. I heard about it, and of course, as a child, I always loved geography, you know. I said, well, going to South America, this is heaven. How could be anything better? All of a sudden, what I've seen, I could smell the charred bodies in the ghetto, the smell of the burning buildings. And here they told me to come to this hotel, I can register and be. So I went to this hotel. And I see in the lobby, it was probably June or July, it was already warm, and people are sitting, Jewish people, sitting the best thing that they had first, anything they had on them, that they saved, you know, during their hiding. And I said to myself, this is impossible. And there was a table with tropical fruit. This is impossible. I actually touched the fruit because I didn't believe. So they told me go upstairs to the second floor and register to be repatriated to South America. I didn't like it because I just didn't have a good feel about it. Sure enough, they gave me some money, so I told them, of course, I have a sister who also wants to, she's hiding in a little forest outside of Warsaw. If you give me some money for her, I will also bring her here. I had more money than I had ever in my life. I got out of as I was getting out of the hotel, fully tell her, to telephone her not to ever come into this next to the hotel. I saw two men coming in. One of them was a guy in long leather coat, and I almost died. He was in a civilian uniform. He was one of the biggest killer in Warsaw. With him was a Jewish policeman. I didn't know who he was. After the war, I found out. He was one of the very few Jewish policemen who were collaborators, but he was a collaborator. So when I found out after the war, his name was Spiewak, and the German was a Conrad assessment. So when I saw these two guys, I left the building. I got to the nearest telephone, and I was telling my sister that I was going to try this place. I say, don't even come close to it. On the way out, I was afraid. After all, Polish people, some of these people who are blackmailers, they call them szmalcowniki. I don't know, there's a person, you know what a szmalcownik was, right? Szmalcownik or szmalec in Jewish is chicken fat. So people who were trying to blackmail us, they were called szmalcowniki. So I was afraid that maybe, well, where would a szmalcownik be? In front of the hotel where they know there are Jews over there. And he sort of looked at me sideways or something, so I lost him, and I left Warsaw. And here's what I'm going to tell you now is something that has a note that maybe there is hope. You know, when I got out of the ghetto, I was roaming. I was not from Warsaw, so I didn't know really the Warsaw, only the part that I know when I was told to go, you know, on my assignments. So when I got out of the ghetto, my sister was helping me because she was working in a coffee shop. I was going to her place, and she was treating me like a customer. But I still wasn't very comfortable about it because I was endangering her. And one day, felt very, very uncomfortable. I saw a man on one of those lawns. I was on my way to, in the morning, to get to be served breakfast for her. But I saw there were a group of people, there was a beautiful part of the Warsaw, and there was a guy lying in a lawn, and people were gathering about him. His face was covered all with the ants. You couldn't even see his face. It was just like a shield that fencers use in the thing. But I recognized him, and I thought he was Jewish, because I used to make contact with him. We in Warsaw, we were trying to, we had a hasło in what's English hasło? When you just wait a second. We used to have a word that we could communicate. What was the password? Something like this. Password. Thank you. So, and I used to make contact with him. The password was Amhu. I didn't know what was Amhu, but it was like a Amhu. I used to say it, and he didn't respond. After the war, I found that Amhu is Am HaSefer, according the people of the book. I learned from the rabbi after the war because I said, what? But it was just a harumph, Amhu. So I was very much taken by that when I saw this guy. He must have committed suicide. He was very always elegant, very well dressed, and he was in that dress, just like that, in that beautiful suit. So I called my sister, I'm not coming, and I took a streetcar and I went somewhere, and I went to a beach. I just wanted to get myself lost. On that beach, I joined three other guys that played hooky from a school. They were underground school in Poland, and they were just playing hooky from the school. So I joined them, and I made conversation with them, and we talked like, they were about my age. I was 16, and we were talking about, what young kids. Of course, I wasn't used to the things that they were talking about, but I made up stories about the girls, about things and other things. And we had a good time. I told him just, that I had trouble with my mother and I didn't want to go to school. And so they gave me some food to eat. About maybe right after noon, when the school was over already, two of these guys left. And one guy was left with me, and we talked for another few hours, another few minutes, maybe half an hour, and he finally says to me, let's go home. And all of a sudden I realized that all this thing that I had for a few hours, that beautiful day that I was talking like a human being to friends and to guys that I made friends with, it's coming to an end. So he says to me, and I was sitting on a beach. Of course, we were fully dressed because still wasn't that hot. And there were some people on the beach still. And I'm sitting kneeling on a beach, playing with the sand. And he says to me, come on, let's go home. And I didn't answer again and again. Finally he says, hey, are you deaf? Let's go. And then I said to him, I don't have a home. I'm a Jew. So he said something, and I thought he was going to say, hey, there's a Jew here. And there were some people who very gladly find a Jew. But he said, Matko Boska, co ty robisz tutaj? Mother of God. What are you doing here? So he took me home and he sheltered me. They had a little place that were holding things. It's almost like a cellar. And he took me home. He says, I tell my mother about you, but I cannot take you upstairs because I don't know how my father was going to react to you. Because, helping a Jew for Gentile was automatically death. They would be just punished with death. So he says, but you can be in a cellar, and he brought me something to eat, napu, and maybe a hard-boiled egg, and a pillow, and something to cover myself. And he says, you can stay here. And I heard the padlock closing, and I thought I was going to choke. Because he said, maybe we were so used to bestiality. Maybe they go, okay, he put me there, he's going to the German or to Polish police, say, hey, there's a Jew here. But next morning he came in, he opened the door, and he said to me, you can stay here, or you can leave. So I said, I'll stay. And I never told him that my sister was working within walking distance from where he hid me. And I told you, when I left, I thought this guy was being, that blackmailer was recognized me, so I left in a hurry. I never let him know that I was leaving. And I survived. I lived in Poland for another 2 years. I studied there at university. Then I left Poland. I came to the United States. And I'll tell you, I got so engrossed with this thing, with the life in the United States, I think I wanted to forget about the Holocaust. For many years, I was being asked to talk about the Holocaust, and I didn't feel I wanted to do it. It wasn't maybe until I came to Pittsburgh, here to Florida, from Pittsburgh, that I was involved in the Holocaust. So I never really thought about it. But one night, I had a dream. I dreamt about it. I wasn't even sure of his name, whether it was Rybakevich or Rybakowski. So I called the Red Cross, and I said, could you find out about somebody like that? And of course, this was almost 50 years ago, and the communication wasn't that great. But finally, they told me, the Red Cross told me that the only way that there is something like that name is in a historical book by a Polish historian, Domańska, and that book is available from a Holy Cross University here in the United States. And I got that book, and I found that he was arrested and hung. And the unbelievable, terrible coincidence that he was hung from a one building that was left standing in a ghetto outside, across the street from the Polish Ministry of Justice. And that's where I used to go when I was coming from my assignment outside the ghetto, because I didn't have an apartment. I was coming wherever I could, to people that offered me shelter for the night. So he was hung there. So I, of course, when I found about it, and that's how I got interested in the Holocaust and everything else, I contacted the Yad Vashem, which is a part of the Jewish Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, and it took many, many, many years, investigations and petitions and witnesses and this and the other thing, and he was named as a righteous among the nations. His name is inscribed on the walls in the Yad Vashem over there. So this is to tell you, I always like to end my presentation, told you that with all the terrible tragedy that befell us, and I think that's religion is all about it too. You have to have hope, because because in the depth of depravity, there's also a height of nobility of human being, and that's what we have to strive for. I'm very happy and glad. Thank you for listening to me. If you have any questions, it is you who deserve the applause, not me.
Thank you, Jerry, for sharing. Luke, can you, the green one, right? Thank you, Jerry, for sharing your story with us. I appreciate it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for being here, for inviting me, and for listening to it, because I know it's nothing that is a pleasure to listen to.
A number of questions came to my mind while you were speaking, and I'm sure there might be some others. So let some people ask, you have any questions? Yes? Okay. Yes, the young man who allowed you to stay in his basement, how come he was hung? Do you know?
The one who rescued me?
Right. Why was he hung?
That I don't know. But the reason, the book doesn't say it, he was just taken as a hostage in a very infamous prison in Warsaw, Pawiak prison, and he was hung. Now, why was he hung in a ghetto from a building? You know, I told you, there were 3 guys that I joined. This is strictly a conjecture on my part. See, 2 of them left, and I was with this guy Janusz, who served me. But the following day, wouldn't he, a young fellow, he was 18 years old, wouldn't he, without any, he was just sharing, hey, you know what, that guy, don't tell anybody, but you know that, I saved him, I'm shielding him. He's a Jew. Don't tell it to anybody. Because he knew how important it is. Of course, maybe these kids didn't say it. Maybe they said it. Wouldn't it be natural for these kids to go home and tell their parents? Don't tell anybody, because Janusz is hiding the Jew. No? That's must have finally.
Right.
So this is the only thing that I can.
Where were you when the war ended?
When was I?
Where were you when the war ended?
When the war ended, I was in this town Lublin, and when Maidan, I guess, because when I left, when I got escaped from the ghetto, I told you I left Warsaw. I went to a part of Poland, to a countryside, and I was hiring myself out as a farm boy, attending to horses or cows and all that. And the war caught me. The end of the war was in this part of the Poland, this little town, this little village that I was working as a farmhand for this widow. That city, that little farmland was changing hands 3 days in one day. The Germans were coming here, and the Russians were opposing him, and they were coming back and forth. And this is where the war ended for me, because once the Germans were pushed back, I figured, well, I'll go east, because I knew that the Russians were already there. And I walked. Finally, I got to the city of Lublin, which was already liberated by the Russian army.